So James Lewis is next. He's over there. I've known James for about 10 years. James works for ThoughtWorks. He's on the technical advisory board. So James thinks about things like the technical radar. He sort of advises clients on trends and where tech is going, open source. And what I've always thought about James is that he sort of likes to think about the sort of dynamics in organizations and the structures and the way that people work. But James also likes to code. So it's born of real experience. So James, come up.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invite. I've just come off a 3-month sabbatical. This is my last week of a 12-week sabbatical, which luckily at ThoughtWorks we get after 10 years, so it's like a bit of a perk. After 10 years you get, hello, there's lots of familiar faces in the crowd. I'm telling people things they already know. But so for the last 3 months I've not really been thinking about software at all, or software development, or programming. Certainly not Clojure, but then I tend not to think much about Clojure, I'm afraid, sorry. And in fact, I've been on holiday, I've been with my family, I've been walking in the Welsh Hills, played quite a lot of PlayStation, if I'm honest. And John asked me to speak at this. Turns out I'm on first, which is amazing. And so, of course, I said yes, because what a lovely bunch of people to come and talk to. So I'm going to be talking today about the future of software. A bit of a big topic, broad. So I'm going to talk a bit about the past, I'll talk a bit about where we are at the moment, and a bit about the future, I think. And I've called it From the Bazaar to the Bizarre. And hopefully for reasons which will become clear. Let me make sure my time is restarting. Okay. So this is the question I'd like to ask, and hopefully, during the course of this next sort of 30, 35 minutes, we'll go some way towards answering and maybe leave you with some more questions at the end. So where does the best software come from? I haven't got a huge amount of time, but maybe we could go to the room quickly. Anyone got any ideas? Where does the best software come from? Sorry? What is best? What is the best software? The most successful software, the most installed software, the most used software, the most open source. Open source. Another hand up. The past. Yeah, Hungarian notation was in the past. Just. So this is the question: where does the best software come from? And I am going to talk a little bit about the past and a little bit about the history of software engineering, because I think it's the history of software development, because I think it's important to understand in the context of where we are at the moment. I will be talking a bit about the trends as we see them in ThoughtWorks. I'm very lucky. I'll come to this. I'm on the ThoughtWorks advisory board, which gives me a Delphic view of software over the last certainly the last 5 years in which I've been on the board. And also, I'll maybe share some things that we're thinking about in ThoughtWorks for H3. So, 2 to 5 years, sort of longer-term horizon stuff. And maybe finish with some craziness, we'll see. So, I'm going to start here. Anyone know who these are? Yep, this is Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. Back in 1969, Ken Thompson wrote Unix, the first Unix implementation. He wrote it in assembler. It was based on a previous OS called Multics. Multics was a interactive operating system. At the time, most operating systems were batch-oriented, business software running on batch-oriented operating systems. But Ken, he really liked this idea of an interactive OS. So when, at Bell Labs, they decided to move away from Multics towards a batch-based system, Ken Thompson decided that he was having none of this because he couldn't play his essentially Space Invaders game. This is true. So he decided to write a new operating system based on the things he liked in Multics, and he called it Unix. It's a bit of a play on words. And I think we can all agree that Unix has been a pretty successful software success story, essentially. Shortly after this happened, or actually kind of at the same time, C arrived. I don't know if people know where C came from. C is basically B, is the joke. C is B, but with data types and structures. And Dennis Ritchie wrote C at the same time as Ken Thompson was writing Unix. And eventually they ported the first Unix to C. The problem with B at the time was that it wasn't fast enough to be used as a systems programming language. But when Dennis Ritchie implemented C, they realized that they had something that they could use, and with hardware becoming faster and faster, they could use C as a systems programming language, so rewrote Unix. I'll fast forward a bit now to something that may elicit some groans, I don't know. Who's used Spring? Hands up, keep your hands up, those of you who've used Spring, if you think that Spring is a successful piece of software. It's vastly successful, right? Hands up again who used Spring in the days of XML configuration. Yeah, lots of people. Yeah, it has changed a little bit. I mean, if you remember back in those days, this was, put your hands down, thank you. If you remember back in those days, this is, especially in Java land, this is like post-1995. I got involved using Spring, I guess, early 2000s. And it was a response against what was seen at the time as this kind of big, heavyweight, awful specification from Sun and the JEE team at Sun. And actually, if you were working in enterprise software back at that sort of time, Spring was a massive breath of fresh air. Huge fresh of breath air. Breath of fresh air, fresh of breath air, something like that. And it's gone from strength to strength. They seem to reinvent themselves every time something new happens. So obviously we've got Spring Boot these days, because we're in microservices, the time of microservices. You've got Spring Boot. But Spring has been massively successful. Jumping back a bit, fetch mail. This is a strange, very small Unix utility. It's basically a mail transfer agent. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's well documented in the book, or in the original paper, The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond. And he describes the development of fetch mail from his perspective as the project lead, and how successfully he managed to get contributors to an open source project, fetch mail. And I think the last time I have any data on this, which is a long time ago, over 10 years ago, there were still 200 people on the mailing list, 200 people interested in fetch mail. Cruise control. Use cruise control, the original cruise control, quite a few people. So cruise control was the first ever continuous integration server. And the interesting thing about cruise control was it was sort of built on a ThoughtWorks project not too far from here. We were building, I wasn't on the team, I was in investment banks. Grey hair, send investment banks. Other people go to this place. The interesting thing about cruise control, it was a huge project. It was probably the biggest ever then agile project in the world. It was spanning, I think it was, literally the joke was it followed the sun. Development followed the sun. We had lots of people in India, we had people in the UK working on it, not too far away, people in the US working on it, literally round the clock. And they were having huge problems with how to integrate the different commits together. Lots of time spent patching and so on. And cruise control essentially was a response to this. It was, if only we could do this automatically every time we pushed to version control. Wouldn't that make life easier? Cruise control is a classic example of software that's been developed as a result of someone having an itch that they wanted to scratch. Another one from Java land. Hands up if you've used JMock. Now, this might be apocryphal, I've no idea. I'm making this story up. But Nat Price and Steve Freeman aren't in the room, so, and I'm sure a lot of you know them anyway, but so I've got a feeling, I think, basically, that the reason JMock was invented and written by those two guys was because the server API in Java at the time was horrendous. If you ever tried testing anything that involved any aspect of the servlet API, so the HTTP request or HTTP responses classes in Java, it was a disaster. You ended up with these stubs that were, you had to implement essentially every single method on an interface that was like 30, 40, 50 methods. So again, I think that this is an example of software that's been written by a couple of people who had a problem at the time. How do we independently test objects in Java? Right, unit test objects in Java. And they wrote some software in response to this itch that they had. I'm presuming people have used this. Might be the wrong conference otherwise. But again, this is what sort of mid to late 80s Linux development started. And again, a bit of a response to someone having an itch. Linus Torvalds had an itch which was around the fact that the BSD, the free BSD efforts, and the Free Software Foundation, the GNU efforts to build a new free open source, essentially, Unix kernel, had stalled. And suddenly this arrived. And the interesting thing about the Linux project was how aggressively collaborative the project was. Really interesting model. It was the first time that you had thousands of people all committing to the same project from all over the world. And this caused a lot of consternation. There's a great article, actually, by a guy called Richard Gabriel, who's fairly well known in the Lisp community. He wrote an article a long time ago, an essay called Is Better Worse or Is Worse Better? Because his original thoughts on this was that the idea of developing in a collaborative open source model was going to produce worse software. Up until that point, up until Linux proved this model, software had been built as cathedrals, smart people in rooms, in universities, or in big companies, the Bells, the AT&Ts, the Xerox PARCs, building software, crafting it, and then releasing it after a long period of time. Linux broke that model. Linux broke that model by aggressively getting people to collaborate on something. Hence, this is worse better. Is the idea that Linux, using a worse development model, might lead to better software, or is better worse? Interesting. This is the theme, I think, from a lot of these projects. And this, again, I'm going back decades now to this original. This is the book, the revised edition. But the original paper postulated as its first principle, every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And one of the crucial observations about why open source software works, how does it work when you've got thousands of people all collaborating on the same thing, is this observation that all bugs, in that case, are shallow. Therefore, actually, with open source software, you end up with better software. The more eyes looking for a bug, the more eyes finding a difficult bug, make it more likely that that bug is going to be fixed later. All bugs are shallow. So the rest of this talk is answering this question about software and what does good software look like. Just ask yourself, this idea of cathedrals, building software as engineers in some closed little room, is worse better or is better worse? So I'm going to segue a little now towards current trends in open source software. This is the original icon and iconography for the technology radar at ThoughtWorks. I've not been on the radar since 2010. I think it was 2011 I joined the technical advisory board. But I've got data. This is the nice thing about this. I've got data going back to about 2010 that I could easily access. So what I've done is looked at some of the obvious trends in open source software over the last sort of 5-6 years. This is, if you don't know what the technology radar is, it's a group of people who come together. We, in ThoughtWorks, it's about 20 of us. We gather information on tools that are being used, techniques, practices, languages on our projects globally. So there's about 3,500 people in ThoughtWorks globally now. Those projects feed information into their sort of countries. They feed it into the regions. And the regions sort of feed it into the tab representatives who get together once every 6 months and create this thing called the technology radar. I'm up there. I never thought I'd be on the same slide as Martin Fowler, but I am. I win. And the interesting thing about this is, yes, and right, this is a massive source of confirmation bias. I'm not going to lie, right? The data I'm presenting is the data that ThoughtWorks has gathered over the past 5 or 6 years, right? So necessarily, it's limited to that as well. But the interesting thing about the process we go through when we build the radar is we sort of follow this, or we exhibit, if you like, this thing called the Delphi effect. You get a bunch of people, a bunch of experts from different domains, different technology expertises. Some are systems programmers, some are front-end programmers, some are designers, some are testers. Everyone's sort of together, bringing their expertise. And we take advantage of this thing called the Delphi effect. This is where estimation, task-based estimation comes from as well, so awkward, but still. Right, there we are. You can all read that. The rest of this 3 hours is going to be me walking through all of these. No, it's not. Just get a glass of water. Thank you. So these are all the trends going back to 2010 that we've identified on the ThoughtWorks technology radar. At the one end, we've got Docker, which is the last one I was involved with beginning of this year. And at the other end, we've got distributed version control systems starting to become popular. Quite an interesting set of some interesting data in here. We don't think we get everything right on this. Point out some. So we've got Google Wave up here. Awesome. We were really excited about Google Wave. For some reason, towards the end of 2012, we got really excited about mobile. Not sure what was going on with that. But there are some interesting trends. I'll run through a few of them. Am I too far away now? No. So this is the first one, just because I'm here. Closure and related tools. So where did closure and sort of related tools around closure start to appear on the radar? So closure first appeared was actually just before 2010. But sort of midway through 2010, we started talking about closure quite a lot. We then started talking about JVM as a platform. This is where we're saying, actually, it's not just closure, it's closure, Scala, there's JRuby. Maybe we should think about moving away from Java and using JVM as a platform rather than, got thumbs up from Corny in the front row, rather than just sticking with Java land. And then we've got increasing diversification and rigor in browser-based languages and things like that. So we first started with closure and assess back here. We moved to trial mid-2012 and adopt in 2014. But as you can see, we actually haven't got that much in the way of other sort of contributions on the radar from closure and the closure community. Now, I'm not sure why that is. Again, it's confirmation biased. It might be because we're not doing a lot of closure projects, therefore a lot of those tools aren't sort of bubbling up to us on the technology advisory board. But it is kind of interesting seeing this sort of trend. So the circles represent tools, practices, techniques related to the overall trend. In this case, closure and related tools. Okay. I'm going to compare that, because it's quite interesting, with something else. Node and the JavaScript community. So we've got some themes up here, right? So we've got JavaScript as a first-class language back in 2010. Treat all code with respect. This was about treating JavaScript code that we're writing with, testing it as we would anything else. Increasing diversification and rigor in browser-based languages. The JS juggernaut rolls on. Churn in the JS world. JS tooling settles to merely chaotic, which I quite like. It's quite a fun one putting that theme together. And then finally, the last one was overreactive. If you look at where JavaScript and Node have appeared, so Node, I'm using Node as the tool. So Node first appeared as assess in 11, trial 14 was adopt. And these are all the JavaScript libraries tooling. I would say 90% of these are package management or dependency management tools. It's quite an entertaining, so the way the radar is put together is people sit around a table and they have post-it notes with their ideas for new things to go on the radar. It's up on the wall, and we walk through each one in turn, and whoever put the post-it note up has to describe it. And you guarantee at least 2 or 3 times there'll be, it's another dependency management tool, it's another build pack tool, it's another, and it's groans and groans. So hence, chaotic. I don't know if this is going to work. How much time have I got? Has anyone come across the NPM drinking game? Let's give it a go. Hang on. There we are. Right, so mirroring would have been easier here. So the NPM drinking game is what and bearing in mind there is a code of conduct here. You call out a noun, someone calls out a noun. If you can npm install that noun, you get to have a drink. So who'd like to go first? Oh, yeah, sorry. Well, hands up first, sorry. I can't hear that. Milton Keynes. NPM install Milton Keynes. Yeah, it's a place name. Is that a noun? I don't know. It's a town. We'll leave that. Mud we had in the front. Mud. NPM install. Mud. Yep. So you get a beer from the back. Make sure you get a beer. Anyone else? Depends on how good the Wi-Fi is here, mine. Dog. Dog. Yep. Beer for you. I tried this yesterday, but I was like, what? Butter. Of course you can NPM install butter. Pretty much the NPM drinking game, fun for all the family. But it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting that there is so much going on in the JavaScript world. I think we've all got, what's the old joke from Prague Dave Thomas is, I don't know what the current the MVC framework, best MVC framework for JavaScript is at the moment because I haven't checked Twitter this morning. That's basically what seems to be going on with JavaScript, and it's kind of strange. Right, well, enough of that. Let's go back to moving on. So the next one I've got up, because I'm here, is microservices. And when did that sort of first start appearing? What trends are we seeing with microservices? So it first started off, actually the precursors, and I always sort of say, and the description that Martin and I gave for it is it's a set of better practices that have been put together from stuff we've been doing for a long time called the name microservices. And you can actually see this. We've got things like continuous delivery, evolutionary architecture, emergent design, build pipelines, again, polyglot development, focus on CDN tools to deliver it. And then simple techniques for performance testing, all things that are kind of, I would argue, precursors for building the sort of systems that a lot of people are building these days. And in fact, microservices first appeared on the radar in 2012, early 2012, in Assess and went to trial. The other fun thing about microservices, it's never gone into adopt. We've never said in ThoughtWorks that this is definitely a good idea, you should go and do it, right? Which is what kind of adopt means. We would laugh at you in the pub. It's called Mason's Razor. But since 2013, you've got this huge explosion in tooling related to this technique. So we start off with a ton of things like console and graphite monitoring tools that start appearing. And that sort of pattern continues, so ending up with Prometheus and the stuff from SoundCloud and so on. And it just keeps getting more and more popular over time. So there's a brief look at a few of the trends in specific either tools or technologies on our radar over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. I'm going to sort of finish this particular section by drawing attention to two themes we have towards the end. The first one is a new wave of openness at Microsoft. So Microsoft finally open sourced their development environments, language extensions, and so on, sort of early 2015. And that sort of only really happened, beginning of this year, really. And then 2016. We called out specifically open source software as a virtuous byproduct. And this was mainly because 40% of everything on our radar this year was produced by Facebook. If you think about React and all the tools around React. This kind of interesting ideas starting to percolate from the open source community as I've known it over the years, which is people essentially like us, self-selecting people who opt in to scratching an itch that they have understanding that it takes quite a lot of work to do that, building communities. And then now when we've got big companies following this trend, seeing this trend, and releasing their own software as open source. I mean, you could argue we've got Twitter Bootstrap way back here, we've got Cassandra, we've got a ton of other stuff. Yeah, and all the big companies are doing it, right? Facebook, Etsy, you've got Microsoft, you've got Netflix, you've got LinkedIn, you've got SoundCloud, you've got Twitter. And should we be surprised by this? I guess is my question. Or should we be worried about it or scared about it? Should we be worried that they're trying to influence the market in some sort of way? And I think there is a bit of concern, specifically around, I've got some concerns around the diversity in our industry. Because they admit, a lot of these companies, that one of the major reasons that they open source their tools is to attract good developers, which is great. If you've got people who are self-selecting in to work on these tools, obviously hire them. They're probably good people. They're going to do a good job for you. But the problem is in the communities, the closed communities I see that are being targeted in this way. I don't think it necessarily does much in the way to open out access to highly skilled jobs to lots of communities who don't necessarily go to GitHub every day. As an example, in ThoughtWorks India, we were specifically targeting people, school leavers, who might not have ever had access to computers at all. Now, those people are going to be deliberately excluded from this kind of programmer thing that's going on with GitHub and these companies. Ooh. But in some senses, I don't think we should be surprised, because this again continues the story that we've seen throughout the last 40, 50 years of software development. I mean, this is a brief timeline around Unix, right? 1969, birth of Unix. 71, Dennis Ritchie creates C. 77, you got the first BSD release. So up until this point, this is hackers. But I'm using the old term hackers as in people who hack on things rather than the term cracker. Obviously, hacker's been stolen these days by the press. Up until this point, this is universities, this is people scratching an itch, this is people experimenting, being interested in what they're doing. 83, Larry Wall released Patch. You could argue that this is actually the thing that contributed the most to the nascent open source movement. Right, Patch enabled collaborative development by enabling diffs to be merged, essentially, right, automatically. People could send patch files around. But then you've got the 80s. Microsoft happened. Microsoft actually had a Unix originally, but they shelved that in favor of what became DOS. But you had the Unix wars. So this is where you get AT&T, who own Bell, kind of trying to hold on to the copyright of Unix. You've got Sun starting up. You've got a bunch of other companies trying to monetize this software that's being created. You've got this pattern. Someone scratching an itch, seeing a problem that they personally have, solving it, and then it being commercialized. And finally, you've got 85, you've got the launch of the Free Software Foundation. So this is the kind of ideological, I guess, predecessor to the open source movement. And finally, in 1991, you've got sort of Linux announced in this timeline. Actually, in 1998, it goes on, is when open source was defined. And it was a group, essentially from a ton of different tribes in that same movement. The old IETF group, which were essentially the old ARPANET hackers. You've got TCP hackers and so on, protocol hackers. You've got the group that were involved in early Unix and the Unix tools. You've got Mozilla, Netscape, that group. And they got together and defined this thing, open source software. But there's this pattern, right? There's this pattern which is people have an itch, they scratch it. You get good software and then it's commercialized. You can see that with all of those things, certainly with microservices. So what does the future look like, right? Based on what these trends we're seeing in open source? Well, first of all, I suspect you can buy 12 microservices for the price of 6. You can probably buy a dozen JavaScript libraries or so on. But I had a look at and this is internal use only, technology strategy, which describes what we're looking at over the H2, H3 period, technologies that we're interested in for internal use. So, each region, what are the interesting things that we think we should be getting involved in the future? This is one of them. These are all actually on our internal technology strategy. Humanity augmented. We're starting to see a massive rise in the number of hardware and software related to augmenting our basic humanity. Elon Musk famously came out and said recently that the problem our brain has got, it's an I/O problem, all right? So we need to increase bandwidth to storage for our brain by building something that sits inside our skull and does that. Humanity augmented. I've got a personal story around this, which is I was lucky enough to be at a conference in Iceland with the developers of EVE Online. They were there sponsoring, and I managed to have a chat with the head of game design, so world design for EVE. And he'd been to a French lab where they'd been doing some VR stuff for a while, augmented reality stuff for a while. And they'd been to this French research lab where it was a technology called direct retinal projection was demonstrated to them. I don't know if anyone in this room has come across this. So this is where essentially rather than have the kind of screens in front of your face that you have with VR goggles or with AR goggles these days, right, you have a laser that scans images directly onto the back of your retina. And this is a real thing, right? You can go into a lab, put your head in a little thing, like when you get your eyes checked. And apparently the guy said, right, I'm going to turn it on my mark because people get a little surprised. He said, right, and he said, like, 3, 2, 1, mark. And the guy said, and there was a dinosaur in the room. Right? This stuff is happening now. Humanity augmented. Another example of this, they're talking about 10 to 12 years of being able to directly hack the the optic nerve. So you just have an electrode on your glasses that does what VR does or AR does within a decade or slightly over. The next thing we've got out there, security, privacy, transparency, this stuff is only becoming more important. The balkanization of the internet, certain special groups wanting to take back control. Think about the co-op, for example. The co-op in the UK, they really like to be able to create community internets, if you like, certainly community clouds, so we don't have to be beholden to the big providers anymore. Another interesting thing in this space that we've got our eye on is the idea of autonomous corporations. And this is related to things like blockchain, distributed ledgers, smart contracts, and where that's going over time. And there's a great science fiction book by Charlie Stross where he talks about autonomous corporations. And he says, the president of Amalgamic Holdings Root, blah, 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 is blah, blah, blah. The secretary is blah, 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 blah. All the shares are owned by those companies in equal measure, and I can tell you that their regulations are written in Python. Have a nice day. This is because someone's trying to sue him because he's a shareholder of one of these companies. This is going to happen. We're going to have automated corporations really, really soon. And if you think about it, Estonia, you could already do it in Estonia. Estonia's got an API on pretty much everything. If you've got an API on Companies House and you can create companies faster than people can backtrack those companies, then essentially you're immune from litigation. Scary, weird stuff. Rise of the robots. What's going on with the rise of the robots? One of the things that really is on the H3 technology, tech strategy for ThoughtWorks is this idea of nanotechnology. And again, nanotech, direct retinal projection, science fiction, autonomous corporations. Until, this came out yesterday, right? Nobel Prize in Chemistry this year went to some nanotech engineers. This, again, is not too far off. Interesting stuff. And to quote, we're living in the future, it's just not evenly distributed yet. Give me some more examples of this weirdness, right? Self-driving trucks are going to hit us like a human truck. Morgan Stanley's figures, this is by 2025, phase 2, 100% autonomous penetration, utopian society. This is talking about the Western world commercial drivers. That's going to be 3 million unemployed truckers, a further 5 million in the US alone. Right? Technology is advancing. The software we're writing is contributing to this. This is, again, last week, was it? When I'm 90, there'll be 1 million people living on Mars. 50 years, that's the plan. 1 million people on a Mars colony. I like this one. You think what you can buy now for $1,000 in terms of MIPS. The prediction, if you follow this graph, is that by normalized to $1,000, we'll be able to buy, for $1,000, the equivalent compute of all currently existing human brains. about 2045. And finally, people are mining asteroids in space. There are actually satellites identifying asteroids to be mined. About 5 years, their plan is to mine these things in near moon orbit. And aliens. We're building stuff. This has been built, and it's open source. A lot of the software is open source. The Square Kilometre Array is being built in both Australia and South Africa. It's essentially a radio telescope the size of 1 square kilometre. And it's going to have the processing power of about 100 million PCs. And the explicit goal of this is to find aliens. True. And this is open source. So if you like Fortran, because they're big on Fortran, you might want to get involved. And finally, this was announced last week as well. This is what Google, Facebook, IBM, Microsoft, I believe. So here's the point is, the trends show, both from internally from what we've got, this growth and continued growth in innovation in open source. The wider industry movement is towards this kind of weird, hopefully utopian, probably dystopian, science fiction future. We're moving towards an even more connected world. The question I want to ask is, who's going to create this future? Right? Who's going to create this software? Who's going to build it? Looking at what I've been talking about with history. Well, I would suggest this quote, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Because at the moment what's happening is you've got a lot of these things being driven by very large corporations, right? Facebook's, Google's, IBM's, Microsoft still. IBM still? Can you believe that? But that was the same 40 years ago. Only then it was AT&T, it was Bell, it was Xerox PARC. I think what history shows us is when you get people scratching an itch, you get great software. So I'm going to sort of finish by saying, I think the cathedral is dead. I think open source software is the way forward, right? Even though it may look at the moment that a lot of these advances are taking place in closed communities. Companies are open sourcing more. People are getting their hands on this software more. And as people get their hands on this software, they'll develop an itch. And what do we do as developers? We scratch the itch. All of these different things are going to be up for grabs in the next 5 years. I've got a feeling, actually, this is the whole thing about AI, right? We've got weak AI all over the place at the moment, but we never get strong AI. I reckon we will. I think, and it's going to be someone in this room, or more likely, it's probably going to be someone in the JavaScript community whose implementation of Conway's Game of Life suddenly starts looking back at them. That would be my example. And then you can npm install it. npm install James, awesome. But it's in your hands. So this quote, best way to predict the future is to invent it. And this was uttered by Alan Kay in '71. Thanks very much.